Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Shavonna McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat. Please type your organization and the question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers throughout the presentation in the chat or out loud, if time permitting. As time allows, we will also unmute folks to ask questions live. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HDD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who can help answer questions during the Q&A session. If we cannot answer a question, we will either get back to you or recommend that you complete a HUD AAQ. Next slide, please. Please note that both slides and the recording will be sent to all participants within 1 week of today's session. Next slide, please. Today's office hour session agenda includes the following: ESG updates and resources, ESG CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG CV Q&A, and today's spotlight session is ESG outcome measures fiscal years 2018 through 2022. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Connie.
Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to remind everybody that this Friday, January 19th, we will not be accepting applications after this date for that 2023 ESG Homelessness Prevention NOFA. That NOFA was released last September. Homelessness prevention was the only activity offered under the NOFA. And due to a very short and fast approaching expenditure deadline of August 7th, we decided it best to stop taking applications after this Friday. So just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. Next slide, please. And just a reminder, just a quick slide, a reminder that we're still working on our ESG guidelines that will replace our ESG state regulations. Our goal is to have that issued by midsummer, and more communication to come later this spring as far as next steps. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Anthony.
Great, thank you, Connie. Just a few reminders this morning. The 2022 ESG award announced, the award reviews are in progress. Of the 9 remaining, 6 are being routed through our contracts division, and 3 are being cleaned up for some corrections to documents. The 2023 ESG awards for the BOS are anticipated to be announced later this month. We are currently reviewing those. Next slide, please. And just a reminder, we have a number of helpful documents in our document library on the ESG webpage, including policies, procedures, templates, checklists, and other useful tools. So please, whenever you have questions or just for a good source of reference material, go ahead and visit our website on the resources page. Next slide, please. And we also want to continue spotlighting our new video library. It takes the place of the video library that had been hosted online, but now we're hosting it on the HCD website on the ESG webpage. And it's just one tab away from the policies documents library. And there is all kinds of very helpful videos and trainings and office hour trainings on topics relevant to the ESG program. Next slide, please. And for those additional questions or just general assistance with your grant, please reach out to your grant administrator, Diana, Sam, myself, Giovanni, and Tuesday. You can always hit the NOFA inbox as well. It's our catch-all for general questions on the ESG program, and we'd love to hear from you. Next slide, please. And with that, I will hand it back to Shavonna.
Thank you, Anthony and Connie. ESG CV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. CV1 and CV2 allocation agreements expired on December the 31st, 2023. Reallocated funds allocations must be expended by March the 31st, 2024. And this slide will be included in the slide deck when emailed. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hours topics. There is no office hours next week on January the 24th. Client file coming up will be client file checklist, new video and documentary library virtual tour, leveraging and braiding funds, ESG monitoring checklist, indirect costs, new CAHCD Tribal Nations Toolkit. Next slide, please. Are there any questions? Okay, if there are no questions at this time, well, we will please turn our attention over for today's Spotlight series for fiscal ESG outcome measures for fiscal year 2023 and 2022, featuring Grant Tutuola, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, and Chris Pitcher. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Giovanna. One more slide. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We are going to attempt to preview the data that we have collected from HDIS, the Homeless Data Information System in the state of California, for the ESG annual program for the last 5 years. We'll talk a little bit more about those outcomes and what you can do to improve your data as we pull it from HDIS to be more accurate for how you actually operate in your community. I will start with my introductions. My name is Chris Pitcher, he, him, his pronouns. I work here in Denver, Colorado, and I am the Training and Technical Assistance Lead for ESGCV for the state of California. With me today is my partner in crime, Grant Tuioti. Grant.
Hello, everybody. My name is Grant Tuioti. I use he, him pronouns. I'm happy to be here. I'm based out of Monterey, California. Prior to working with Chris and ICF, I was working for the Monterey and San Benito Counties COC. So really excited to be here today and talk about the data that we're all working with.
Thank you, Grant. Next slide, please. All right, so we are going to talk about how we get data. So for the annual ESG program, this is going to be very, very similar for how we did it for ESG CV. We're not coming to all 44 COCs and saying, can we see your data? We're going to the place in California that has all your data. That's HDIS. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that data works, how it flows. We're going to show you the outcome measures as the data stands today. Obviously, as data is corrected and fixed and we get it more quarter over quarter over quarter, it looks different, but this is what it looks like today. And the reason that these 5 years are so important is we're going to look at this 5 years of data and say, okay, generally speaking, shelters outcomes should look like this. We want to see shelters improve on these two metrics moving forward. And this will inform Connie and her efforts for the guideline process. It'll also inform HCD's efforts just to evaluate and to fund organizations through the annual ESG process. So this is really important to look at these outcomes and think about how you can affect those numbers locally and ultimately statewide. And then we'll talk about recommendations for more accurate data, really cleaning up data quality. If your data in HMIS isn't reflective of your client's experience, it's not going to be so in HDIS. So that is something very important to remember, is that we need to focus on data quality. And once you see these numbers, you might want to start looking at those numbers, how your providers perform to the baseline that we were able to acquire from HDIS for the past 5 years. So with that context setting, I'm going to let Grant take us to the next slide and get into the details.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. So what we really wanted to highlight as we got started was how we get a hold of the data and then how we start working with it. So like Chris mentioned, we don't go to each individual COC. Instead, we pull data out of HDIS. So here we kind of have our 3 big buckets of what our flow looks like. So we have data entry, data processing, and then ultimately the evaluation of it. The data entry, that is the foundation of everything that we do. It is the data that you put into your HMIS. It is how the data is reflective of what's going on in your community. So your biggest influence in what these outcome measures look like is going to happen at this data entry phase. So what you put into HMIS is ultimately what we receive. So you put the data in HMIS, then it gets sent over to HDIS. From HDIS, it generates a outcome report for us. These outcome reports vary in what they are, but they're generally a source data that we then use to evaluate it. Then we work on evaluating it. The way that we can evaluate is we look for all COCs, or we can look for it by each individual COC. So next slide, please. To start off, we did all of California. So when we look at the overall performance of fiscal year 2018 to 2022, we had about 107,365 enrollments over 4 project types: emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid housing, and homeless prevention that fall under ESG. Out of those total enrollments, we had about 17,730 that led to positive destinations. That's about a 17% enrollments led to positive destination overall. A positive destination in this particular case is defined in 2 ways. For emergency shelters and rapid rehousing, it's any exit to like a permanent housing destination. This could include, a rental unit or being reunited with family or friends in a permanent manner. For street outreach, we expand that definition to also include temporary destinations like an emergency shelter or moving back in with friends in a temporary manner. So this big graph on the left here, that shows over time the number of enrollments and positive destinations for each of these years. Big thing to flag when looking at it is that we saw a really big spike in fiscal year 2022 on the number of people served, or number of enrollments served. We then can break that down overall by looking at each of these individual project types. Emergency shelter, by far getting the most enrollments. When we look down a little more on the positive destinations, though, rapid rehousing's rate of positive destinations is outpacing all the other project types, which is generally what we would expect and want to see. So this right here is just a quick summary overall performance of what we're looking at. When we get into trying to answer the question of how we're performing, we're going to be looking at the following 7 metrics. Can we go to the next slide, please? The 7 metrics are these guys outlined right here. The component is going to be the project type that we're looking at. The metric is the number that we're looking to evaluate if we're performing or not performing, so above and below it. And then the achievement is what we're looking at. So for each of these metrics, we're looking at a slightly different thing. The first one, which is rapid housing, that's going to be the percent of clients who receive services for 6, 9, and 12 months after being housed. This is tied directly into that housing move-in date for rapid housing projects. We're looking to see how many people were moved in during that project, and then we're trying to also then see how long they continue to receive services for. We want to see an increase in move-in date, of course. For emergency shelter, we're looking for a reduction in the average and median length of stay, tied to metric 3, which is going to be the number of exits at a positive housing destination. So for emergency shelter, we want to see a decrease in the amount of time someone spends in emergency shelter with an increased amount of positive destinations out of it. For upper housing, we want to see an increase in people who have a move-in date, as well as an increase of people who exit to positive housing destination. So linking both of those together. We are also looking at return to homelessness. So for the projects outlined here, we're looking for the percent of clients who return to homelessness after exiting to a PH. In 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months. So looking at how long it takes for someone to return if they return. Street outreach, we're just mainly looking at those who obtain a housing destination upon exiting their enrollment. And then homeless prevention is those who return to the homeless service system, in emergency shelter or street outreach after receiving some of that assistance there. I'll pass it over to Chris to kind of run through the specific results and outcomes that we are seeing from each of those metrics.
Thanks, Grant. And those measures that Grant just outlined are the same measures that we use for ESG CV, so they should not be unfamiliar to the audience. But this is the data that we are looking at for annual ESG over the last 5 years. So we haven't been able to benchmark for ESG CV because it was pandemic funding and there's nothing like it. We go from $12 million to $319 million. There's really no comparison between annual ESG and ESG CV. So this is our first really bite at what it looks like annually within the much smaller $12 million-ish program and what we expect performance to look like. So as Grant mentioned, we have outcome measures by component. This one is for retention and rapid rehousing. So we're looking at the percent of folks who received services in rapid rehousing and remained housed for 6, 9, and 12 months. This is very similar to the way HUD looks at rapid rehousing retention. And you can see here that at the 6-month mark, we have about half the folks housed. So half the folks have either moved on to permanent housing or returned to homelessness. Other half are there. They needed more than 6 months of assistance. And that's not something that's going to shock anyone, I think, here in California, given our tight economy and housing availability. Folks are staying in rapid rehousing. We see the number go down, though. At 9 months, more folks are getting out of rapid rehousing, and at 12 months, more folks are getting out. That is good, and there is still a recognition that you could be housing some of the most hardest to serve in rapid rehousing, and after 12 months, you still need to have them in the program. That's okay. We do like to see this downward trend up. So if you are a rapid rehousing provider in the state, you should be looking at your data and saying, okay, how much retention do we have at 6, 9, and 12 months? And is it better, worse, or the same as what the state has as a baseline? Because that's how you're going to evaluate yourself. So that is our first measure on rapid rehousing. We will go to the next measure. All right, this one is about emergency shelter. So again, over the last 5 years, we want to see you looking at what is your average and median length of stay in emergency shelter. And we have broken this down by the 2 different types of emergency shelters that can be set up in our HMIS and data systems, and that is the entry-exit model versus the night-by-night model. Entry-exit, you enter, you're there until you're exited. Night-by-night, you enter and exit every night. Even if your stay is contiguous, that is the way those shelters operate. So when we look over the last 5 years for just emergency shelter run in the entry-exit model, which is the bigger majority of shelters in the state, we see the average length of stay at 79 days. We see the median at 32 and less than 32 and a half days. So we would like to see that shrink a little bit so we can serve more people while still getting, and remember that emergency shelter has 2 metrics, while still getting folks in a more positive housing situation than emergency shelter, because emergency shelter is not housing, it is shelter. So if you are operating an emergency shelter that operates entry-exit, you're going to look at being less than 79 on your average stay and less than 32 on your median. If you are operating a night-by-night shelter, those are a little bit longer. We'd still like to see those come down to the 79 mark. And the median come down a little bit as well, so long as you're not just exiting people to say, hey, we have lower exits or lower length of stay. That is not what we want. We want folks to get in, get housed as quickly as possible, keeping those emergency shelter situations for emergencies and not just warehousing people, actually housing people. So that is half of the metric for emergency shelter. Next slide, please. All right. This is our second rapid rehousing outcome measure. So over the last 5 years, we're looking at rapid rehousing exits to a positive housing destination. So that means that after rapid rehousing, we did not go back to shelter. We did not go back to the streets. We went to permanent housing, living with friends and family, anywhere that is longer term and more stable than rapid rehousing. So in the last 5 years, 17,000 exits, 38% were to a positive housing destination. That is a little bit low, but that is where we're going to start. So if you are a rapid rehousing project, you want to have more than 38% of your exits to positive. I think this is low because it might be a data quality problem that Grant might talk about, whereas we're just not getting the housing exit destination in. We're done with the client. We just had to do that last part, and we're on to the next client because we're busy. So you can probably really affect this just by checking your data quality locally in your rapid rehousing programs, because I believe that more than 38% of folks in rapid rehousing programs are moving to another positive destination and not backwards or in a different, less stable situation than is rapid rehousing. Next slide, please. All right, this is a system measure. So this is looking at more than one type of ESG funded component. So it's emergency shelter, temporary emergency shelter, which is now done with the ESG CV, and street outreach. So we want to see those folks who return to homelessness after getting into permanent housing. They were in one of these projects. We got into permanent housing. We're in rapid housing. We're in permanent supportive housing. We're in PH. We're in just regular rental housing. But then we want to see that we want to measure that at 6, 9, and 12. Who is returning into the system? Where are we having folks come back to? So of the over 14,000 that access rapid rehousing, the returns are very low. We're seeing a return at 6, 9, and 12 to be in the 1 or less than 1%. So you would want to say in my programs that are part of this, Are we having folks returning to homelessness at less than 1%? That's where we want to set our goal. This is already very low, so you might go a little bit above this from time to time, but across the state, it's a very low. We're not seeing a lot of returns, which is good because we already have a fairly significant homelessness population in the state of California. So having folks return to homelessness is not ideal. Next slide. All right, this is one of my favorites because street outreach is often overlooked in HUD measures. There's only one performance measure that HUD talks about, and it is not this one. This is the one that I think street outreach providers are most likely to really be graded upon as far as how street outreach gets folks out of emergency situation into a more stable situation. So we're looking at over the last 5 years, the percentage of those folks that obtain a positive housing destination out of street outreach, which is pretty much anything. Shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, wrap-free housing, PSH, other permanent housing, it doesn't matter. As long as you're not on the street, that is a win for street outreach. So over the last 5 years, 21,000 folks enrolled, and about 10% are obtaining a positive housing destination. I think this is a little low, but again, look at your data locally as a street outreach provider. What is your number? Is it around 10? Is it a little bit higher? I think again here, this is where the conversation Grant is going to have around data quality can be important. There's a lot of folks that we enroll in street outreach and we don't give destinations because either we don't know or again, we're just too busy, we're on to the next client. By cleaning up that little bit, you can actually improve your measures greatly just by making sure that those destinations are correct. Those destinations are in HMIS. So that is definitely an area where you can, as a street outreach provider, evaluate yourself and improve just by checking and making sure that your data quality is really capturing all that good stuff that you do that might not be reflected in HMIS and therefore HDIS and therefore these outcome measures. Next slide. Okay. It is very hard to evaluate homelessness prevention. I think anyone who has worked with Connie on the homeless prevention one-time NOFO realizes just how difficult homelessness prevention is within the structure of ESG. ESG is very rigid on the way in which homelessness prevention can be provided, and it's tough to evaluate. So we came up with something to evaluate homelessness prevention, and that is the percentage of folks entering the homeless service system. So back into emergency shelter, temporary emergency shelter and street outreach after receiving homelessness prevention. This says ESG CV, it should just say ESG. So we'll correct that before the slides go out. But we got financial assistance. I'm a person that was close to experiencing homelessness. I got financial assistance, but after that, I still became homeless. So out of the 2,800 folks in homelessness prevention, we had 136 return to homelessness, either shelter and street outreach. That's only 5%. So that's pretty good. That could also be telling us that we're serving the wrong folks because not enough folks became homeless because of homelessness prevention. It is a double-edged sword, but there's really no good measures for homelessness prevention at the national level. So we're going to look at this. We want to see returns 5% or less for homelessness prevention. That would be successful. So again, if you're an HP provider, look at this information. Where do you measure to this? How can you improve? Here again, this is a little different. Once you do your homelessness prevention, folks will just show back up in the homeless services. You might not know about it. So this might be one that's a little bit harder for you to analyze, but your HMIS lead should be able to figure this out without too much difficulty. Next slide, please. Okay. Our second emergency shelter metric is emergency shelters with positive housing destinations. And again, this is a tough one. So we have length of stay, which we want to see shorter, but we want to see more folks getting to permanent housing. So those are two different things that kind of go side by side. So the 63,000 folks that are enrolled, 7% had a positive housing destination. And that's whether that's transitional housing, permanent housing, wrap-free housing, regular market rate housing, anything that falls in there that's more stable than emergency shelter. Again, 7% is very low. You should look at your number and see what it is. It should be much higher. And this is definitely a place where data quality can play a big role. We have someone in an emergency shelter. We stopped serving them. We know they went to wrap-free housing, but we didn't say that in their destination information. So going back and checking that destination information can be very useful. Now, obviously, there are folks in shelter that go back to the streets. There are folks in shelter that would go to other shelters. That happens, but I don't think 7% is at all accurate of your actual efforts out in the state of California. So check your data quality on that for sure. we'll be measuring about 7% and looking for increases over that over the coming years. Next slide, please. I'll hand it off to Grant.
Thanks, Chris. So for this next section here, we're going to be talking about data quality. To set correct expectations really quickly, what we're going to be doing in this kind of next phase, couple things, is doing more of a high level defining of data quality and a conversation around it. We're not going to go specifically into any HMIS data standards or HMIS policies and things along those natures. We're just going to kind of do a high level overview and then flagging a couple different things. We'd like to really encourage you to lean into your HMIS leads and your system admins for your local policies around data quality and monitoring. And then, of course, feel free to send any AAQ questions that you may have. Next slide, please. So to really kick us off, we want to really define data quality. As we mentioned a couple different times around here, how you enter data and certain questions are going to be very reliant on not just the exit pieces, but also any interim updates that you do and how you enter them into your system. So when we talk about data quality, it's far more than just completeness. We're looking for completeness, timeliness, accuracy, and consistency, all four of them together. So timeliness, just to kind of run through them really quickly here. Timeliness is the degree which data is collected and available when it is needed. So it's when that you enter it, how well available is that to pull it? Because if you have put bad data in and then you correct it later on, but we already reported on it, it's not going to show, it's not going to be reported well on it. So keeping an idea of some of those timelines of how you enter the data is important to keep in mind. Completeness is something that I feel like we talk about a lot, making sure that all the required data is entered and completed in there. So just kind of keep doing as you're doing and try to keep that completeness high. Accuracy is the degree in which the data reflects the real world of client or service. This one is a really big one. This is one that each community is going to have the best lens on. Does your data reflect the efforts that you are doing? We mentioned a couple times on this presentation that we suspect the outcomes to be much higher and much better than what we're actually seeing. And that ties directly into what you are putting in and if what the story we're saying is accurate to the level of effort or outcomes that you expect to see. So take a review on your accuracy of the data and what you are seeing at the local level to kind of help inform this. And then consistency. So how consistent are we over time? Next slide, please. As we alluded to several times, we're starting to look at these data, define these measures, work through these data, develop baselines, because we're planning on using this data for a variety of different things. So what we put in will lead to the decision. And if we put incorrect data, incomplete data, or data is timed incorrectly, that could lead to bad decisions. Next slide, please. What we send through, what this slide here is just to highlight that what we do in HMIS has a larger impact. More people use it, different programs use it, the COC and ESG all have different reports and different things to use the data for, right? So it's not just used for ESG reporting. What we really want to highlight here is be aware of all the different components that might be using your data and to really lean into your HMIS lead and your system admins and some of those data monitoring plans that the COC should have and approaching all these things. So just kind of being aware and overseeing of all the different reporting things that lead out of your HMIS data. Next slide, please. This is really just hammering the rules that we have for each of the different components. So these are some of the big partners that should have within each community. So the COC and data quality isn't just for the HMIS lead or for the end users. It really is an entire community effort. So some of the key responsibilities for like the COC and the COC governance really is to review and revise and approve the privacy plans of the HMIS, security plans, and the data quality plan itself. And ensure consistent participation of the recipients and subrecipients. Then this ties into what the HMIS lead does, which is monitoring that compliance, supporting with technical assistance, and administering all those different HMIS contracts and agreements. Each participating organization and end users then is to follow some of those compliance measures, participate in the PIT and the HIC and the reporting, and the privacy and security compliance that goes along with that. Next slide, please. And I think I'm turning over to Chris.
Thank you, Grant. So just kind of going back to what we can do, we now have 5 years of annual ESG data. We'll begin looking at it quarter over quarter, moving forward, starting in 2023, 2024, so on and so forth. So our role as HCD in maintaining data quality is to let you know where your data stands. So we are showing you where the measures are. We're asking you to look at them locally. We will continue to look at them on a regular basis to make sure that you have it. But the data quality is something that you can have a great impact on in your community. Go to your data, make sure it's accurate. Once it's accurate there, it'll be accurate in HDIS. One of the things that HCD can do is leverage the written standards and tie projects to local data quality plans. So that is something that we'll be considering, as well as defining data quality requirements through the ESG contracts. We expect as a shelter that you have a median length of stay of blank. You have this. So we can begin to use these things in contracts to have you raise your data quality and performance. And obviously through the monitoring process, we'll be looking at data quality to assure that your programs are meeting the standards that California has set based on the data that you have provided us. Next slide, please. A few resources that are available to you should you want them. The ESG program HMIS manual, it is the go-to place for how to use HMIS for ESG. If you should have questions about that, I am the author of that. You can always come to me directly should you want. HMIS data quality monitoring toolkits are out there that you can leverage and create data quality plans. There's a ESG, not ESG, an HMIS, comma separated values, CSV, data quality tool called AVA that your HMIS lead should be familiar with and can help you operate. And then there's also a dual enrollment and housing inventory chart, duplicate inventory training resource that can help you figure out those aspects should you be a housing provider. So just a few resources and one last slide just to follow up on some things that you should, that we are recommending you should do. First, make sure you have a data quality plan. Look at not only is it a plan, is it enforceable? How are we maintaining data quality locally in our local data? Since it's being used at the state level now, we need to make sure our local data is solid or the state level data is not. So the data quality toolkit is a good place to go for that. Leverage tools for data quality like AVA, other ones on the slide prior. And then review your COC performance outcomes as a community. As I said, these are the measures. You know where the number is. Find the number that for yourself, where your performance is, and just try to outpace yourself as you have done in the past, as you would want to, looking at your performance and try to always improve, always improve. So those are a few things that we recommend you might want to think about doing. Next slide is our last slide. So thank you for sitting with us. I'm not seeing any questions, but we will take the slides down and give you a moment to gather any questions you have around HMIS, around data quality, around the data measures that we shared this morning. We'll give it a few minutes. You can either ask your question in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can talk to Grant and myself, should that be of interest to you. All right, I am so, oh, great, yes, thanks, Andrea. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Should you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to Grant or myself, and we would love to have any of your questions after this, should you have them. Since we're seeing no questions or comments, I'm gonna hand it back to Shivana to close us out this morning.
Hello, thank you, Grant and Chris. Let's see if, since we don't have any questions, then again, thank you. A survey will pop up as you exit the session. Please be sure to answer so that we'll know the types of trainings that you're interested in receiving. Thank you again, Chris and Grant, and all attendees. Enjoy the rest of your day.